Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hassett,
And I'm Dr. Jim Morris.
and this is The Archaeology of Anglo-Saxon Cemeteries.
And we're joined today by our colleague and friend, Professor Duncan Sayer. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Brenna. Wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
You're most welcome.
And it's so far from the office.
Yes, it is.
So, Duncan, the most important thing, why should anyone care about Anglo-Saxon cemeteries? You insist on bothering their dead people. Why do you do it?
But that's quite a big question, isn't it, Brenna? Why do we care about archaeology? Why are we studying the past? What is it about the ancient remains of the past that speak to us in some way that means that we want to study them, that means we want to touch them, that means that we want to find and discover them? And with Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, it's a very sort of visual, it's very tactile, because for at least for people studying in the UK, it's connected with ideas of Englishness and a past that you can sort of see and understand. For me, Anglo-Saxon cemeteries are a really good jigsaw puzzle, because what you've got is bones, and bones, as you know, Brenna, being an osteoarchaeologist, what they do is they tell us things about the lived experience. So they tell us about how people were alive from their pathologies and from isotopes and from DNA evidence, their age and their gender and all that sort of stuff, which is wonderful. And early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries also have furnishings, by which I mean material culture. So they get brooches and beads and weapons. And those can add an extra layer of nuance on top of the interpretation that allow us to take a step further.
So furnishings, I'm kind of thinking, I mean, my instinctual response to furnishings is I'm thinking like IKEA, like bed frame, coffee table. You are interested in the furnishings. I believe you are relatively well known for finding fancy furnishings. What kind of furnishings are we talking about that we are looking at in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries?
Well, so grave goods. Okay, so when you talk about a furnished burial, what you're talking about is burials where the individual is dressed, or where the burial is presented. So, as I just said, with brooches and beads and things like that, or with weapons, so swords and shields and spears, knives, belt buckles. Sometimes you get animals in the graves, which is where Jim's interest comes along, I think.
But you do also get bed burials.
You do get bed burials.
Yeah, so actually your IKEA analogy might actually is...
So, and it's Swedish as well, Billy Bookcase? Like, is there not some sort of Viking connection there?
Well, Sutton Hoo is a really good example of this then, isn't it? Because there are chairs, okay, and there's boxes, and there's great big hanging bowls with chains on and things like that.
There are chairs?
Yeah.
This is an actual
this
IKEA...
is a new thing for you,
the Brittlewell
I did
burial
not know this
has
at all.
a folding chair. You might call like a campaign chair or something like that, where it folds out and you sit on it.
So it's like a camping chair. Why would you put a camping chair in your enormous burial?
Well, this is part of the question, isn't it? This is why we're doing it in the first place. This is why we're doing it in the first place, isn't it? Because we want to find those sorts of things out. Why are they putting that stuff in the grave in the first place?
So
those types of furnishings are only found in the most elite, in those burials that we would describe as princely burials.
Are they the
like
only
Tutlow
people allowed to
or
sit
Purwell.
down?
Or is it them that are sitting down?
So have they got people showing up to their funeral parties that are so important they need chairs?
Perhaps. Yeah.
So this is okay. So I'm very excited about IKEA.
Are you more excited now?
Yeah, I just because I have context for it. I don't really. We had this conversation before we started recording. I don't know who the Anglo-Saxons are. I'm not particularly bothered about it. I believe they occur at some point in the medievalish.
Well, let's set the scene then. Let's set the scene.
Okay.
So what time period are we actually talking about here? What dates are we talking for early Anglo-Saxon?
So early Anglo-Saxon, you'd put somewhere between about 450 AD and probably around 700 AD.
So we're end of the Roman period. Romans have gone. Actually, well, that's a different podcast. Actually, what happens to them?
We will never get to the Romans on this podcast.
We don't have written sources wise. There's, from my knowledge, the Venerable Bede, and is Venerable Bede a bit later?
He's 8th century.
He's 8th century. So we are in effect, archaeology is our primary data, and as far as I'm aware, actually we've got some settlement evidence, but not much settlement evidence. The majority of our archaeological evidence is cemeteries.
Exactly. Yeah. And what you've articulated very nicely there is some of the ambiguity that surrounds this. So there are some sources. So you've got Gildas, and you've got the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but again, it's written about the same time as Bede. You've got some law codes, but they're a handful of them, and that's what you're working with. So the period has been called either the post-Roman period, which is a little bit too like, well, they're the Romans and now us.
Yeah,
it's almost like it's not as good as the
you're
Romans.
defining the period by
Right,
what came
after.
before it.
Yeah, exactly. You could call it the Dark Ages, but again, that's a bit negative, isn't it? Suggesting it's somehow.
Are there any
not as
ways to
good.
refer to this period that are not pejorative?
Early Anglo-Saxon.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
And that's why they're the
Which,
Anglo-Saxon.
to be honest, is why it probably sticks. You could
Fair
call
enough.
it the early medieval period as well. But again, what you're suggesting is it's the sort of the first half of something else, because it's not really the Middle Ages, especially when you're talking about the 5th century. It's probably closer to the Roman period in the terms of the way people live and survive and think about each other and themselves.
How do people live and survive and think about each other?
They eat food, interact.
So,
Because maybe not as much changed as we think, and this is one of the big questions about the period.
can we get there from cemetery evidence?
Yes.
How? So if we're talking about, because I may be entirely wrong, but I'm reasonably sure you actually have excavated and written about a number of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries.
Yeah.
How do we get the burial evidence to kind of tell us about who the Anglo-Saxons thought of themselves? What are they defining themselves against? What are they not? Is there a big change from what came before in terms of cemeteries?
So I'm going to start with your terminology there.
Yeah.
The Anglo-Saxons, whereas we were talking about the early Anglo-Saxon period.
Right, okay.
And I think that's an important distinction there, because there is no guarantees that the people that we are investigating who are buried in these places are or think of themselves as Anglo-Saxons at all.
Right.
That's something that we apply later on, probably because of our own prejudices. And it's a term really that became significant after we got a German monarchy. So Queen Victoria has done quite a lot for the country, but one of the things there, and the other point at which the Anglo-Saxons become quite a significant idea as a people or a concept that linked to the origin of Englishness is also when Henry VIII decides he wants to make a break from Rome, because suddenly you need to look for a new church, and what better place to look than in the Anglo-Saxon texts than the Latin ones.
And does it go back to Alfred the Great, kind of in effect, for trying to form an Anglo-Saxon kingdom in conflict with a Viking invaders? So at the point in time you're talking about, people wouldn't have gone, I'm Anglo-Saxon.
No, exactly.
Would they have been Jutes and Saxon? Or?
So Bede describes people who migrated to Britain in the post-Roman period as consisting of 3 boats: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And really, those 3 terms, those 3 ethnic or tribal terms that he's used, have stuck.
Yeah,
it's a lot more complicated than that. And one of the things we've been able to do by digging the cemeteries, by collecting new samples, if you like, is to interact with genetics and DNA laboratories and be able to explore the relationship between Western and British Irish DNA within the British Isles from post-Roman or pre-Roman and Roman period, and that in continental Northern Europe. Okay, with the assumption that there's going to be a contrast between those two. And what we can see is that you can look at all the Bronze Age stuff, loads and loads of Bronze Age data, a decent amount of Iron Age data, and that we've categorised as Western British and Irish. And then when you get to about 500, all the DNA after that point is 75% continental Northern European from the cemeteries we've got.
In the Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. And of course, those Anglo-Saxon cemeteries are not all across all of the British Isles. They're concentrated in the Kent, East Anglia, kind of up into
south coast, west coast, south coast and east coast, really. And so the samples that I was able to take follow the south coast, southeast coast, and then the east and northeast coast of Britain. So we're very deliberately tracing the outline of the UK. But you can find Anglo-Saxon cemeteries in Derbyshire. So it's a widespread phenomenon, even into the 6th century. But it tends to focus on the east coast, which would make sense because those are the sites that are closest to the continent, really. Yeah. What is interesting is that revelation about 75% really put to rest a quite significant and long-winded and occasionally quite confrontational discussion about the nature of migration in the period. This is your question about who these people are in the first place. Right up until COVID, there were books being published that say there is no migration. There is a continuity from the Roman period into the 6th and 7th centuries. You can see that in, for example, we talked about Sutton Hoo. The Sutton Hoo helmet is a Roman pattern. It's a Roman military helmet, but with this sort of Swedish style imposed upon it. So is this about continuity? Is this about the re-emergence of Romanitas amongst the elite because they're trying to say, well, we are still the same people as we always have been? But the DNA evidence now changes that because it says, absolutely without question, there is a significant migration into this period of people into the east coast of Britain, and that is one of the drivers behind the cultural change that happens. And of course, the linguistic evidence is quite a good way of helping to prove and support that, because we speak English, we don't speak Welsh. So you have to have a very significant impact, and migration of people is a good way to do that. What's interesting, I think some things that gets missed occasionally, is that 75% is the big headline figure, but that means that 25% of the DNA, even in East Kent or Suffolk, places you absolutely associate with this sort of migration here, is 25% Western British Irish. And that's perhaps what's really interesting about this.
So you've mentioned the kind of cultural change, and I assume that by some means of archaeology, we can sort of get at what that looks like, what the material culture is like. So what kind of material culture are we talking about in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries that's sort of signalling, besides the camp chairs, which are, of course, the most interesting thing to have ever happened to my archaeological knowledge. But, what is this sort of cultural change look like in actual dirt terms?
There are no furnished burials in the Roman period. All their furnishings are food vessels and shoes. Okay, whereas in the early medieval period in the east of England, the Anglo-Saxon cemeteries we're talking about here, then you're suddenly burying people with weapons and full dress costume, and that follows patterns that you can see. Men of a certain age are buried with weapons. Children very rarely. We have found several now, but very rarely in comparison. So you can actually start to do stuff like age comparisons and things like that to look at those sorts of things.
So what does it mean to be buried with a sword? Like, can I be buried with a sword? May I have some glorious, amazing sword? Do I inherit it? Do I earn it? We talk a lot in archaeology about whether status is something that you sort of just have, or you have to fight for, you have to earn. Can I have a sword?
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
I'm getting a camping chair. I'm getting a sword. This is so far my favorite early medieval period.
Why not?
You have a boat as well.
Oh, the boat's going to be too much. That's too much even for me. I don't know. I'm not sure I like boats enough to spend an entire afterlife in them. No, but so the sword thing, because so let us not pretend that half of the public interest in Anglo-Saxon is swords and the other half is also swords. Possibly boat burials, I'm not sure. But the sword thing, people sort of know about Anglo-Saxon swords. You have been on the BBC talking about various types of swords.
Yeah.
So who gets a sword? Why do I get one? What have I done?
That is a very complicated question.
It's quite interesting, isn't
and
it?
answer it in 1 minute.
So who gets swords? Well, the people put the sword in there. So it's the people who they want to give a sword to is the ultimate answer.
So I don't really decide if I get a sword. It's everyone who's burying me.
Yeah, exactly. It's that whole sort of the dead don't bury themselves. Although I have a problem with that statement itself because it forgets those people who do, and they're the key here. It's that community of people that are choosing to place objects in the grave, and they're choosing to place a sword there. Now, whether it's that in the sword's case, whether it's actually about the person or the sword is more interesting. And I think that swords are quite a significant displayed artifact. We've now got seven swords. No, we've got 4 swords from...
You wish you had 7 swords.
Why do men always lie about their swords? I just...
many more than
guys.
And it was
thought.
this big.
They're all the same length and they're all the same width, which is
Are
interesting.
they? That's interesting.
So we've got 4 swords from the current excavation that we're doing in East Kent, which is really cool. 2 of those swords have got pommels on. One of them has got a small silver pommel that's clearly much earlier than the other fittings on the sword. We've got a scabbard mouth that is made of copper alloy and gilt and has sort of stripes on it. sort of striations, if you like. The pommel on that is silver. So they're making it of different materials. There's a bit of a clash there, if you like, but also it's very small. So that's earlier, probably late 5th century, whereas the scabbard mouth is probably 6th century. Okay, that's really interesting.
So they're curating it.
They're curating it, yeah.
But
exactly.
and they're changing bits. When you were talking about different pommels, I was thinking almost of, I was going to God of War computer games where you can upgrade your axe and your sword by adding a different pommel to it.
Absolutely, and the Anglo-Saxon narratives that we do have do talk about adding to your sword.
Wow!
So why not?
So they've gone up 2 levels of damage.
These things are effectively old weapons. They're the ones that are constantly talked about in Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian literature, as being reliable, being useful, and they're the ones that are portraying status and identity onto the people who are buried with them.
So these are the swords that are then going into the burials. So is it?
Well, are they? This is the point,
going to be my question.
Yeah, because only 2 of our swords have got those, and we tend to be fixated on those as in the literature because they've got the pommels on and they're amazing. But 2 of our swords don't have those. And what I'm hoping we can do with the DNA evidence is start to put some chronology on this as well.
Okay.
I know that one of my sword's burials is earlier than the other sword burial, and I know that they're buried in close proximity. What we've seen before in the genetics at places like Dover, Buckland, is there are groups of men that are related to each other. We can see that in the DNA. We can see that in the teeth metrics. So it seems that there's much less diversity amongst the male populations. What I'm wondering, and one of our research questions really that we're developing is to think about, can I see the chronology of sword burials? Is my earliest sword burial without a pommel? Have they taken that pommel off and put it on the next one, and that's gone in? So is this actually one sword that's repeating and being buried multiple times, or are they different swords with different meanings?
But that would raise all sorts of questions, because that would suggest that they know where the sword is buried. They're going back to.
But you're still thinking of it's a composite object. You're still thinking it's a single object. So the bit that's identity of the sword is that bit at the hilt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I can take that apart and put it on another blade, is it the first sword or is it a new sword?
Well, this is like Trigger's broom.
It is exactly.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think may be a British cultural reference.
I'm staring blankly at Jim now because he's just said a series of words that I instantly associated with Bruce Trigger, the archaeological.
Bruce Trigger, the archaeological theorist,
and
had
Marxist.
a broom.
Yeah, he had a broom and he replaced it bit by bit until it held a huge amount of cultural meaning.
Yes,
is that correct?
In fact, yes.
Okay, good.
We replaced the handle of the broom, and then when the brush wore out, he replaced the brush of the broom.
Right.
So he had the cheapest broom in the world. It lasted the longest, but was it the same broom?
Was it ever the same broom?
Yeah. So this is the case with these swords as well, I think. But also using those older pommels on more recent weapons is a way of making that connection to the past. What is perhaps interesting is that I have burials from this site where all the sword burials are going round them. There's one burial in particular with no artifacts in. A male, age sort of 20 to 30, somewhere in that area, 18 to 25, something like that.
We are notoriously bad at guessing age. Absolutely. It's just we are not good at that.
So he's a youngish man, and he's got a ring ditch around him, and his burial is quite deep. He's got no artifacts. But all of my weapon burials that we've excavated so far, and all 4 sword burials, go around that grave.
So that would suggest that grave is quite an important central place in the cemetery.
Yeah, it's early, isn't it?
It kind of leads us on to the question then of how these cemeteries grow and develop. I know you've written about this before, so kind of do you have a central burial that starts it off that then other people are very close to, or is it a bit more organic?
It's a bit more organic than that. This is quite unusual. I've only seen that in a few different places. What I think is that you've got a significant kinship starting point, if you like. Some people in the continental literature, when talk about Merovingian cemeteries, will talk about founders' burials, but they're very rarely the earliest burials in the cemetery. So it's a very what you're tending to do is prejudice furnished burials by identifying them as founders' graves. I think really in this case, it's a way of highlighting that we are being misled by the presence of swords in graves because we are drawn to that as a piece of material culture. This burial, which I've described to the students as the king of the cemetery. I don't really mean that in a literal sense, but more of, think about the importance of this person. Everybody else is buried around them. They are telling stories about that person. Every single burial. So we're talking about 3 or 4 generations where they're standing there burying somebody else with reference to that early granddad, great-granddad, great-great-granddad. Okay, so he's becoming a legend despite having no artifacts. But we tend to put so much emphasis on the presence of a sword or a shield that we forget that those types of burials exist. He would have had a small barrow over the top of him, and that draws the attention. And I think that's really where these narratives are really important, because you've got to think of cemeteries as places to tell stories. This is why the dead don't bury themselves is a misnomer. It teases you down the wrong path. Okay, cemeteries are places to tell stories. In the picture we've got here, we've got an excavation, and this is the Oakington cemetery that I excavated with students a few years ago. And they're excavating, they're working together, they're telling stories themselves about that person. They don't know the name, but they're the first people to see that individual, to interact with them face to face for 1,500 years. They're actually doing the same sorts of things as the people who are burying them. They're just doing them in reverse. Yeah. And what I mean by that is they're climbing into the grave. They're moving body parts around. They're thinking about the objects and their placement. The people who dug the grave, they are laying out the body and they're placing those artifacts in there. Okay, they're not just dead and then fall into it. They are deliberately placed and displayed. We tend to reconstruct illustrations by having lots of very rigid people standing without mud on them.
It's very difficult to do CAD drawings of mourners. I think it's very difficult. And it's expensive to get someone.
We should probably explain the picture to anyone listening.
Yes, so for anyone who is not watching this visually, there is a lovely image of a group in. Can I describe that as early medieval dress?
Well, they're basically wearing digging clothes.
Yeah.
They're wearing digging clothes, but is that not like a hooded cloak somewhere?
So what I've done on this, so this is an excavation photograph, and this is on one of our busy open days at the site. So there's many visitors. And what I've done then is added on a layer of Anglo-Saxon costume and artifacts, a shield boss, a seax, a knife, a spear, a pig being slaughtered, a reconstructed house in the background, a brooch and some beads, to try and give it a flavour of the early Middle Ages, to make an analogy between the sort of different layers of activity going on. Because in this picture, you've got some people who are digging, you've got some people who are directing the digging, you've got some people who are explaining the digging to visitors, and you've got some people who are sort of preparing a wider feast or conversation. We've got my collaborator on the project, Richard Mortimer, killing a pig.
I bet he quite enjoyed that.
He's a vegetarian.
That's just me.
I had great fun with that. And standing next to him is my dad with a spear, which is also quite fun, I think. In the background, we've got a lady sitting on a camp chair.
Oh, excellent.
There you go. It's always back to the chairs.
It does look very comfortable.
Okay, and she's sitting next to an Anglo-Saxon hall building and watching the proceedings. So the point of what I'm trying to do with this is say there's different levels of interaction here. There's people who know a lot about what's in the ground, and there's people asking questions about it. There's people who visited from quite far away. There's people whose involvement is to prepare the wider environment, the party or the conversation, the outreach exercise that we were engaged in there. And that's exactly the same as in a funeral. You're not just laying out the dead and everybody knows where every artifact is and the name of the person. Some people have travelled a long way to get there. Some people have no involvement in the artifacts that are going on, and some people have actively placed them. And what we see in several burials is this sort of different ways of interacting with that narrative. So occasionally, and there's a burial adjacent to this one, we had a woman who's buried face down with a child next to her. She's buried face down, her legs were crossed. Often the interpretation of these is of live burial or punishment or something like that, because it's unusual, sometimes described as deviant. In this case, I don't think it could be any further from the truth, because her hand passes underneath her chest, her left hand passes underneath her chest, and is just resting on the child's pelvis. There's something very delicate about that. What's really interesting is that she's got a wrist clasp on. These are pieces of early Anglo-Saxon dress that hold your sleeve together so it doesn't get caught up in an upright loom.
Before
buttons.
Yeah,
they're serving the same function as a button or a
ribbon tie.
Yeah, ribbon tie, clip. what I'm thinking of a cufflink. The sort of thing. Okay, so bring it together.
I do not often think of cufflinks.
No, it's fair enough. So they're serving the same function as that. And what's interesting is rather than being at her wrist, that cufflink or wrist clasp is about 4 or 5 centimeters ahead of a hand above her fingers. So it looks like what someone has done is put her hand on the child's hip and then drawn her sleeve over it by pulling it so that you can't see it. So what she's trying to do, what that person is trying to do, those people probably who are laying out the body, is conceal the fact that they've just done that from everybody else. And that's really interesting. So we haven't got just levels of display here, we've also got levels of concealment. And really I think that level of detail only becomes apparent when you actually dig this stuff.
I think that's the kind of key fundamental thing for me. It's the archaeology, and it's really careful archaeology to be able to actually find that kind of evidence and notice that kind of evidence as well. And the beautiful thing is the archaeologists are the next people to encounter that kind of after the people that actually physically did it.
And they're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
They're telling stories about that person to each other in
Yeah.
that grave, and then with the ultimate ambition of telling the story of that community, which is effectively why they're using those cemeteries in the first place.
I mean that's why I asked you actually to put this picture in, because it's actually from your book. We're not going to plug your book, but it's available in all good and bad bookshops.
It's freely available
as well.
It's freely
available online. There you go. So it's actually freely available online.
The bookshop of the internet has many books.
So it is published open access. So it is freely available online. And your book does have some great box plots, and I love a box plot. But actually, it was this picture at the back that kind of really got me thinking, because actually it's that engagement with the body that archaeologists have that can help us think about these processes and those stories you were talking about.
I've studied Anglo-Saxon cemeteries since I was a master's student, so we're talking about a few years now. And
surely not many years, Duncan.
I did a master's.
We're all 25.
Enough. But the master's dissertation looking at the organisation of those. I then wrote a PhD looking at the organisation of those, looking at the chronology, thinking about exactly those questions that we've just been discussing. And it wasn't really until I started excavating them with students, so not just excavating them myself, but actually organising the people's interaction with those, and thinking about the sort of wider interpretation and presentation of those to the public. We always try and work in the public sphere so that there are visitors, and if they want to participate, they can. We're showing them what's there. We're telling their sort of archaeological stories about what's there and their community. So I really started to understand a little bit more what these cemeteries are about in the first place. And I think it's that picture really is what I'm trying to do with that, to say, look, ultimately, this is the same conversation. We're just doing it 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later. And that's why I think that answers your first question in many ways, isn't it? 'Cause it's that combination of bones, isotopes, genetics, artifacts, spatial location, all of that together is what can get us to that picture. And I've managed to get this down in conversation to generations, so we can talk about different generations in these spaces, and we can see how the cemetery is changing. We can see how the attitudes are changing, and that's wonderful.
And that's, I'm glad you managed to answer the one question we asked, because we're now almost finished. I believe we have one more question.
Yeah, so we're going to ask everyone this question, and it's a classic question that any archaeologist that would have had an open day such as this, and members of the public come along and see the archaeology. So have you found any gold yet?
Yeah. Well, I'm currently digging a early Anglo-Saxon cemetery in East Kent, so the answer to your question is yes. Yes, we have. We've found plenty of gold. We've found artifacts that we have to report to the British Museum under the Treasure Act, including the silver pommels on swords. We've got the gilt scabbard opening on one of the swords. We have a silver and gold brooch with garnet inlays from this season's excavation, which we're appearing on Digging for Britain after Christmas. So yes, we have lots.
And yet he still works for a living.
Yes, yeah.
And that has been the archaeology of Anglo-Saxons. Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Brenna Hassett.
I'm Dr. Jim Morris.
And thank you very much, Professor Sayer, for joining us and telling us why I particularly should care about getting my own sword and camp chair.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful to have a conversation with you both.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to The Archaeology of. You can watch the show on our YouTube channel and on Spotify. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd be kind enough to leave us a review and rating, we would really appreciate that. See you in the next episode.